I slammed my middle finger right in the judge's face, just as he was about to set me free. He thought he was being merciful by giving me community service for a jewelry store heist, but I didn't want a second chance. I wanted to sell. I had to insult his entire lineage just to force him to slam that gavel and hand me a one-way ticket to this hellhole. Most people pray for freedom, but I've spent 2 years perfecting a plan to get in. Because the psychopaths who turned my home into a bonfire are trapped behind these bars, and they have no idea I'm the one who locked the doors from the inside. 2 years ago, these monsters treated me like a human science experiment. They drugged me until I couldn't feel my own hands, then laughed as they made me put a wet towel in a microwave. The explosion didn't just level my house, it left me with a scarred face and a grandmother who screams in terror every time she looks at me. The legal system was too toothless to bite, so I decided to become the shark myself. I didn't come here for rehabilitation, I came for the harvest. And day 1 in the yard, I've already found the first name on my list, Fatty. One of the original clowns who used to treat me like a punching bag. He thought I was still that same weak kid. He grabbed my hair and started barking about how I needed to respect my elders in here. I didn't even let him finish the sentence before I introduced my knee to his chest. I didn't stop until his face looked like raw hamburger meat. He begged for mercy, crying like a toddler, but I decided he didn't need the use of his leg anymore. One snap later, and I had my first trophy. But the real target was Sang-chan, the big boss. I even have a tattoo of my grandmother on my chest, just to make sure I never lose my edge. I already had the headguard in my pocket. I found out the creep had a history of harassing students, so I gave him a choice. Do what I say, or lose your career. He chose life, and threw me into the same cell as Sang-chan. As soon as I stepped inside, the lackeys tried to test me. Big mistake. It took less than 60 seconds to leave the whole squad gasping for oxygen. Sang-chan finally looked at me, and recognized the burn scars on my face. He wasn't scared. He thought his years of kickboxing made him a god. I told him I'd take him down with just one finger. He thought I was bragging. He didn't realize that one finger was on the trigger of a painkiller spray can. I blinded the guy before he could even move. Then, I went straight for the forbidden zone. One kick to his crown jewels, and the legendary kickboxer was making sounds I didn't know humans could make. He started screaming about cheap shots and unfair rules, but I was too busy hitting him high when he guarded low, and low when he guarded high. It's basic combat math, and he was failing the test. He started swinging wild, completely blind. He hit a pipe and sprayed water everywhere. I grabbed a towel and soaked it. It felt poetic. I bound the wet fabric around his hand to lock his arm in place, then used that leverage to slam him into the concrete. I figured since he used a damp cloth to turn my house into a crater, it was only fair I used one to turn his brain into a 30-second hot pocket. No beep needed when this cycle is over, just the sound of his skull hitting the pavement. Suddenly, the memories started flooding back, my grandma foaming at the mouth, the doctors telling my mom that my presence was toxic to her recovery. They even suggested a nursing home. My heart felt like it was being put through a shredder, and I took all that pain out on Sang-chan's face. The guy was a mess. He actually managed to crawl up and thank me for washing his eyes with blood. He got a lucky kick in and sent me flying. He started laughing, calling me a loser who only won because he couldn't see. He mocked the towel. He mocked my past. He said I used to moan like a bug when he beat me up back in the day. He thought he was back in control, but I've been training for this. My mysterious master taught me that in a place like Juvie, you use everything. Painkiller spray, blankets, towels, anything to ruin your opponent's day. I lunged at him, grabbing him by the waist and driving him back. Then I saw it in my head again. That damn live stream. Sang-chan and his goons filmed my burning house. They told the whole school I was a drug-addicted arsonist. They even threatened to go find my grandma in her hospital bed just to get more views. The rage wasn't just a spark anymore. It was an inferno. I hammered my fists into his gut. He tried to block, but I didn't give him a chance to breathe. I went feral. I grabbed his finger and twisted it until I heard the bone snap like a dry twig. The sound of my knuckles hitting Sang-chan's face was the only music I needed. It was rhythmic, wet, and absolutely soul-cleansing. I raised my fist again, higher this time, letting the weight of every lost night and every one of my grandmother's tears settle into my arm. Sang-chan managed to throw up a weak, trembling hand, his voice a pathetic wheeze as he begged for forgiveness. He actually said he was sorry. Can you believe that? Like a sorry is supposed to unburn a house, or unbreak a woman's mind. The sound of my fist connecting with his jaw again was my only response. He had the gall to call us just teenagers, saying we were just playing around and having fun. Fun? My house turned into a charcoal pit and my life turned into a nightmare, and this trash calls it playing around. I couldn't swallow that. I grabbed a bunch of metal coat hangers from the corner, cold, jagged, and perfect. I didn't say a word as I forced them into his mouth, silencing that lying tongue. I gripped his jaw shut, watching his eyes bulge, as he realized I wasn't there for a conversation. His words made me want to vomit, so I told him to just keep that mouth shut for the rest of eternity. Words are for humans. For monsters like him, only pain. In that moment, I could see the memories flickering behind his terrified eyes. He remembered testifying that I was the one who set the fire. I hammered his face again, thinking about my grandmother. I remembered her broken expression, the way we couldn't even claim insurance, because these bastards framed me for fraud. My hands were already soaked in his blood, but I didn't stop. I remembered the cold, sharp look in his eyes back then, the way he told me to stop shaking like a coward. He told me to grow up. Well, look at me now, Sangchon. I'm grown, and I'm your worst nightmare. People always ask why some of us live in the past, why we can't just let go of the bullying and move on. They say time heals all wounds, and you should just walk away quietly. I'd tell those people they're full of it. I didn't want to live like this, but the world didn't give me a choice. So, I learned to fight. I didn't learn for sport. I learned to erase the people who erased me. 5 months passed under a gray, suffocating sky. Juvenile reformatory cell 204 became my kingdom. I spent every day with my hands around Sangchon's throat. I didn't care that he was bigger than me. Rage is a hell of a power booster. I tightened my grip, watching his face turn a lovely shade of purple. I glanced at another inmate, a kid who was basically my personal secretary at this point, and told him to check the status. The kid didn't even hesitate. He scrambled over to a chalkboard and added a tally mark, muttering that this was the 4th time today the boss had passed out. He reported the total 898 times. For 5 months, I made sure Sangchon died and came back to life every single day. We were closing in on 900. The inmates started blabbering about how we make him faint daily, but I shut him up with a glare. I told him to stop talking and keep watching. Suddenly, the fat kid by the door started panicking. He hissed that they were coming. The heavy thud of boots started echoing down the hallway. It was a guard, sounding like a disgruntled bull, screaming about where I was and why it was so loud. He stomped over to cell 203, but the guys in there immediately pointed the finger at cell 204. I just stood there, letting the shadows of my cell wrap around me like a shroud. When the warden finally looked into my room, he froze. I gave him a look that probably promised him a spot on my list if he opened his mouth. He didn't say a word. He just turned tail and started shouting at everyone else to be quiet, claiming he was going to check the CCTV. Another guard whispered to him, asking why cell 204 got special treatment. The guard snapped back that the higher-ups told them to save me, whatever that meant. He grumbled that I'd be out in less than a week anyway, so they just had to endure me for a few more days. I stood there, counting the seconds. 6 days. In 6 days, I'd be a free man, and the real game would begin. I needed to start preparing. The intercom crackled to life, breaking the silence with a robotic announcement about visitors. In the middle of that gray hell, I saw a woman walking toward the gates with a purpose. It was Anna. She hopped out of her car, acting like the heat was the most oppressive thing in the world. Despite being dressed like she was headed to a corporate board meeting, she stood in the shade, looking at the prison walls with that arrogant smirk of hers, probably wondering if I was still holding up. When I sat across from her in the visiting room, I kept my face like stone. 3 parts boredom, 7 parts, get me out of here. Anna, on the other hand, was all smiles. She tilted her head, giving me this radiant, fake-as-hell grin. I told her to stop it. It looked uncanny valley, levels of plastic. She teased me, asking if my heart was fluttering because of her big sister act. She reminded me that we were playing the role of siblings, and that she had to look the part for the cameras. I pointed out that no sister visits her brother in a designer suit. I told her to drop the fluff. I'd handled Sangchon, even if he was basically a vegetable at this point, and I was ready for the next name. Anna giggled, commenting on how fresh I looked, now that I'd tasted a bit of revenge. I told her to cut the chatter and tell me about the next target. She pouted for a second, before dropping the intel. The next guy on the list had moved to Gangnam. He's living the high life now. Apparently, he's the grandson of a hospital director, but on the surface, he looks like a saint. She showed me his file. Yeon Baeom, a model student, top of his class, high scores, student council member. The kind of kid teachers want to clone. I looked at his picture, that friendly, easygoing face, and felt the bile rise in my throat. I remembered that face. I remembered Sangchon pointing the camera at Yeon Baeom during that live stream. Yeon Baeom had stood there, looking like the devil's favorite son, telling everyone that I was a drug addict who burned down my own house. He'd leaned in close to me back then, his eyes full of pure, unfiltered malice, and asked me if I had a sister. He wanted to know how old she was, if she was pretty. I shoved the photo back at Anna, my voice trembling with a hate that 5 months of juvie couldn't dull. I told her that this model student was the one who truly destroyed my life. He's a monster wearing a human mask, and I'm going to tear it off. I went back to my cell, where the other inmates were already kneeling, waiting for me like I was a god. I didn't even look at them. I just called out for Sang-chon. The fat kid reported that the trash hadn't eaten lunch. I walked over to the corner where Sang-chon was trembling, his face pale as a ghost. I grabbed him by the throat, reminding him that eating was mandatory. He started wheezing, his veins popping out as he struggled to breathe. He managed a tiny, pathetic sorry. I tightened my grip. I told him I'd already warned him. Only humans get to speak. He started thrashing, desperate for air. Medical science says that repeated trauma and lack of oxygen lead to brain damage and personality shifts. I didn't care. I watched the light leave his eyes for the 899th time. His hand fell limp, and I just let him slump into my arms. I called out to the other inmates, telling them I had 6 days left. I ordered them to check the count and bring me some tissues. The cell started smelling like a literal sewer because Sang-chon had lost control of his bowels. But I didn't flinch. I just wanted the time to move faster. 6 days later, the stamp hit my release papers. I walked out of those gates, leaving the darkness behind and stepping into the blinding light of the outside world. I looked at the sky and felt like the world was finally starting to make sense again. After 1,200 rounds with Sang-chon, I was free. Anna was waiting for me, of course. She lowered her sunglasses and looked me up and down. I asked her if she'd been waiting long, but she just scolded me for not calling her Nuna. She grabbed my arm and dragged me to the car, saying we had work to do. We met up with a stylist named Suji. She looked at me like I was a blank canvas. She told Anna she'd never worked on a face this wonderful in 12 years of makeup. Anna bragged about me, saying I still looked like a kid. They threw a wig on me and started working their magic. When they were done, the burn scar was gone, hidden under layers of professional grade makeup. Suji stepped back and called me a hot boy. Anna was practically swooning, telling me to go to school and study hard. I looked in the mirror at this new person staring back at me. Lee Yoon-an Sung, a handsome, perfect transfer student. I told them I was ready. Suji and Anna laughed about how I had zero manners, but Anna's eyes stayed on me. She knew that underneath the K-drama-led exterior, there was a beast waiting to be unleashed. While I was getting ready to haunt his hallways, Yeon Byung was sitting in his classroom, lost in his own thoughts. He was obsessed with his teacher, Mrs. O. He was thinking about her upcoming marriage and how it made him want to go crazy. He was a predator in a school uniform, hiding in plain sight. But the peace of his classroom was about to be shattered. Rumors were spreading like wildfire about a handsome transfer student coming to class 3. The girls were practically screaming with excitement. The teacher walked in and slammed his books down, trying to quiet the chaos. He announced that a transfer student was joining them. I walked in, kept my head down, and gave the simplest introduction possible. My name is Lee Yoon-sung. Nice to meet you. The teacher asked if that was it, and I just nodded. I walked to my seat under the predatory gazes of the whole class. But school is the same everywhere. As soon as the teacher left, a guy walked up to me, calling my introduction headache-inducing. He started mocking me, calling me a loser. It was a pathetic performance. I could see the 2 delinquents sitting right behind him, laughing and pulling his strings like he was a puppet. He was just the sacrificial lamb they were using to test the new kid. I didn't say a word. I just sat there, waiting for the teacher's footsteps to fade down the hallway. Once the coast was clear, I decided it was time for a proper introduction. I didn't use words. I used a kick that sent the guy flying. When his goons tried to jump in, I slapped the life out of them. I grabbed the leader, Jung Ho, and lifted him off the ground like he was a sack of flour. The whole class stared, their jaws hitting the floor. I calmly dusted off my sleeve and looked down at the unconscious heap on the floor. I asked him if my introduction was still too simple. I told the room my name again, Lee Yoon-sung, age 18, hobbies, reading and exercise. I stared at them, my eyes burning with a fire they couldn't understand. I told them that the things I hate aren't in this room yet. The hallways were buzzing. Everyone was talking about the monster transfer student who wrecked the class bullies on his first day. Yeon Byung heard the rumors too, but he acted like he didn't care. He called me a thug from some corner and went back to playing the perfect student, offering to help a girl with her heavy books. He was so mature, but the local thugs didn't get the memo. A group of them cornered me in the bathroom. The leader asked if I was some kind of athlete. I didn't answer. I just started swinging. I moved through them like a ghost, leaving a trail of bruised bodies and shattered egos. I grabbed the leader by the ear, watching him squirm on the floor. I mocked his designer clothes, telling him I was jealous of how much money these rich kids had. Suddenly, a guy named Sang-guk stepped out of the shadows. He was bigger, meaner, acting like he was the alpha of the toilet. He wanted to know who I was, so I gave him a quick, hands-on demonstration. It was a short, messy encounter that ended with him gasping for air on the floor. And honestly, it's the most action he's seen in a bathroom since his last failed attempt at a Tinder date. By the time I was done, the bathroom was a total disaster. Later on, Sang-guk tracked me down and told me to follow him. He said he'd give me what I wanted. I followed him to a secluded spot, and there he was, Yeon-biom. He gave me this friendly smile, acting like a benefactor. He complimented my fighting skills and asked how my grades were. I stayed silent. He laughed, calling me the strong and silent type. Then he made his pitch. He told me he sponsors kids who are good at fighting. He told me to name my price. He bragged about his family's buildings in Gangnam and his grandfather's hospital. A jagged memory of the classroom flashes through my head. Yeon-biom leaned in close, his breath a sickening mix of expensive coffee and lies. He mocked the ruins of my life, asking if the fire had left me rotting in some temporary shelter, before licking his lips like a predator and asking with fake concern if my family needed a handout. I looked at him and felt the weight of my past pressing down on me. And for the first time, I let him see the monster behind the idol boy wig. I told him exactly who I was. I watched the color drain from his face as the name Lee Yoon-sung finally clicked in his warped brain. The nerdy bookworm he'd spent years incinerating for views wasn't just back. He was standing right in front of him, and he was significantly more dangerous than a keyboard. Watching his jaw go slack was worth every second of the 5 months I spent in that juvie cage. He tried to grab my hair, his hands shaking as he touched the fake strands, his voice cracking while he tried to wrap his mind around the fact that I'd orchestrated every single step to get to this exact point. He remembered the True Education live streams he used to run, where they'd humiliate me for clout. Back then, Sung-chun was the face of the operation, mocking me for my mother's failure to give me a name that wasn't generic. They laughed about my grandmother's coma, promising the audience a live stream of her final moments. It was all a big, hilarious joke to them, but looking at him now, the laughter was gone. I let him know that I hadn't forgotten a single second of that content. I told him that if I got the right kind of compensation, maybe, just maybe, I'd feel a little better. I played the part of the greedy mercenary perfectly, asking him to show me just how sincere his wallet really was. Instead of panicking, the narcissist actually laughed. He told me I was stubborn, a real piece of work, and that he hated being underneath anyone. He figured out I wasn't just some street brawler, I was a professional, and apparently, that was a quality he admired. He invited me into his inner sanctum, leading me down the stairs of his academic empire in Gangnam. On the surface, it's a generic study cafe building. From the 2nd to the 4th floor, it's filled with kids pretending to study while their parents pay for the illusion of success. But the 5th floor and the basement, that's where the real rot lives. He called it a one-room hotel, but it's a cage for the kids the world forgot, runaways who think they found a safe haven, not realizing they just stepped into a spider's web. When the basement door opened, I met Kong Min. He's the kind of generic muscle brain who thinks his bicep circumference is a valid substitute for a personality. He looked at me like I was a piece of gum on his shoe, asking Yeon-biom why he brought a nerd into their playground. Anna's voice was ringing in my head the whole time, reminding me to keep my cool, that she was handling the logistics on the outside. Kong Min started running his mouth about how my name was the same as the loser bookworm from back in the day, even mocking the way I kept one eye covered. He thought he was being intimidating, stepping into my space, asking if I had a death wish. Yeon-biom just stood there with that sick, entertained smirk, watching us like it was a cockfight. I didn't flinch. I told him if he was unhappy, he should do something about it. The meathead was ready to pop a vessel, but Yeon-biom shut him down with a single look. He told the kids to stop barking and reminded them who signs the checks. He then decided it was time for my entrance exam. He handed me a photo and told me to lead a group of runaway girls to the shelter. He wanted to see if I was willing to get my hands dirty, to prove I was just as much of a hollow shell as the rest of them. I followed the plan. I found the group of girls, kids who were clearly desperate for a roof and a warm meal, and played the role of the helpful older brother. I led them straight to the 5th floor, making sure they felt safe and protected. Yeon-biom was practically vibrating with excitement when I reported back, asking if I'd mentioned the sauna in the basement. He kept calling the place a protective shelter. his eyes gleaming with the kind of cruelty that only a true predator possesses. He handed me off to Kong Min for the next phase of my training. Walking behind that mountain of useless muscle, I felt the familiar weight of my mission. Yunbeom is a snake. He always keeps an exit path clear. He never gets his own hands bloody, always pulling the strings from the shadows while he maintains his golden boy image at school. To bring him down, I can't just hit him. I have to dismantle the entire nest. I need him to trust me, to think I'm just another cog in his criminal machine. As Kong Min started punching numbers into a keypad, revealing a room filled with kids staring blankly at computer screens, I realized I was finally inside the belly of the beast. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a digital sweatshop, a factory where childhoods were traded for forged IDs and predatory car titles. The slab of meat next to me, Kyung Min, didn't even wait for me to process the scene before he started barking orders at the nearest keyboard jockey. Apparently, we were on a tight schedule to flip some stolen titles before the heat caught up. I played the role of the curious rookie, asking exactly what kind of community service we were providing. Kyung Min gave a heavy sigh, as if explaining the alphabet to a toddler. He laid it out with the pride of a Fortune 500 CEO. We forged the IDs of the runaways, we signed the car leases under these stolen names, and then we vanished the vehicles into the black market. The poor sucker, whose name is on the paper, wakes up with a 50 million won debt and a criminal record, while we sit back and collect the profit. He laughed, a wet, guttural sound, bragging about how they even milked insurance policies out of parents by using their kids' runaway status as collateral. It was a beautiful, clinical cycle of misery. Kyung Min looked me over, his eyes lingering on my face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. He found it hilarious that a nerd like me, who looked like a high school reject, was carrying around a debt that looked like a telephone number. He figured I was there because I had no other choice. A runaway, a victim of the very system he helped run. He offered me the standard career path. I could try to pay back the impossible debt, or I could become another cog in the machine, working under Yunbeom's greasy thumb. I analyzed the room with a cold, detached logic. The kids who brought me earlier weren't guests. They were livestock. I noticed their clothes, designer labels that were obviously knockoffs, the uniform of the desperate who still want to feel human. They weren't being paid. They were working off a debt that Yunbeom ensured would never be settled. Kyungmin confirmed it with a casual shrug, admitting that anyone who stepped foot in this shelter belonged to Yunbeom. It was a harvest of the vulnerable, and Yunbeom was the one person at the top who stayed untouchable. Then Kyungmin made the mistake of mentioning my sister. He patted my shoulder with a grin that made my skin want to crawl off my body and leave the room. He mused about how pretty she was, suggesting that her lack of money and protection made her the perfect target for a place like this. My jaw tightened until I thought my teeth might crack, but I kept my face as blank as a fresh sheet of paper. I let that rage settle in the pit of my stomach, a cold, black coal I'd use to burn him down later. That disgusting laugh of his was officially on its final countdown. He shoved a stack of papers into my hands. The initiation test. I was supposed to go back to the girls I'd brought in and get their fingerprints on these contracts. On the surface, it looked like a standard shelter agreement, a bunch of legalese about protection and housing. But tucked between the lines were clauses that turned their lives into a high-speed rail to hell, loan agreements, power of attorney, the works. Kyungmin's voice went soft, a mock sympathetic tone, saying that if they were pretty enough, they'd be let out eventually. His appetite was clearly as bloated as his ego. I took the papers and headed to the girls' room, feeling the weight of the cameras I knew were hidden in the walls. I swung the door open and threw the contracts onto the floor. I didn't offer a polite explanation or a brotherly smile. I just told them to ink their thumbs and sign. One of the girls, the one with more fire than sense, started barking back. She talked about leaving, about calling the police, about how contracts can't be signed under duress. I stood there in silence, letting her tirade wash over me. I remembered Kyungmin's warning that kids these days are too smart for their own good. I felt a smirk tugging at the corner of my mouth. I realized exactly what this was, a stage play. These girls weren't runaways. They were plants, part of Yunbeom's elaborate screening process to see if I had the stomach for the dirty work. If they were looking for a monster, I was happy to provide a live performance. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I just turned around and locked the door. The sound of the bolt clicking home was like a gunshot in the small room. The girl's bravado evaporated instantly, replaced by a sharp, jagged fear. A few minutes later, the only sound in the room was the heavy, rhythmic thud of a calculated lesson and the terrified silence that followed. Kyungmin came sprinting down the hall, fumbling with his keys and screaming like a man who thought his favorite toy was being broken. When he finally burst in, he found one girl collapsed on the floor and the other pinned in my grip. He looked horrified, his voice trembling as he asked what the hell I was doing. I just looked at him with eyes that I made sure looked like they belonged to a serial killer. I told him I'd gotten the fingerprints, despite the resistance. I asked him why he was so surprised. Hadn't he told me he was waiting for results? I watched him swallow hard. He looked at me, then at the girls, then back at me. He was clearly unsettled, probably wondering if he'd invited a genuine psycho into the house. He tried to play it off, saying he was just worried about my progress, but I could smell the sweat of his fear. He'd put me in a room with CCTV to see how I'd handle non-compliant victims, and I'd gone straight for the throat. That's when the architect of this nightmare, Yoonbyum, drifted into the room. He had that same hollow, golden boy smile, apologizing for the checkup. He treated the whole thing like a corporate trust exercise, telling me that in their line of work, loyalty and sincerity were the only things that mattered. He told me not to worry about the girls, that they were his people anyway. He was officially welcoming me into the fold, unaware that he was just inviting the fire to sit at his table. He told me we'd start the real work tomorrow. I watched him leave, feeling like I needed to scrub my soul with lye just for being in his presence. As the door shut, Kyungmin turned off the lights, his face illuminated only by the sickly glow of his phone. He wanted to show me the creative side of the business. He pulled out a strip of red cellophane and taped it over his phone's camera lens, revealing the hidden pinhole cameras in the rooms upstairs. He laughed, that same vile sound, explaining how they made a secondary profit from voyeurism. He was practically vibrating with excitement, explaining how to angle the pinhole cameras so we only caught the best parts. He treated the equipment like it was made of solid gold, warning me that if I dropped a battery or cracked a lens, I'd be paying for it with my own skin. It was a factory of filth, and he was the proud floor manager. He started getting nostalgic, which is always the first sign of a villain who's lived too long. He mentioned Yoonbyum's genius, how he'd built this entire nest of human suffering from scratch. He called him an internet criminal prodigy, as if that was something you'd put on a resume. Then, he brought up the nerd, the same nerd he used to torture back in high school. He laughed about the True Education live streams, boasting about how the whole thing was Yoonbyum's masterpiece, pulling the strings from the shadows while everyone else got their hands dirty. He didn't realize that the person he was talking about was currently standing 3 inches away from his jugular. Then, he mentioned my sister. Again, he started digging through his memories, his face twisting into this greasy, predatory look as he remembered her. He talked about how she was the pretty sister of the nerd, the one who didn't have a cent to her name after the fire. He practically salivated as he remembered the night of the incident, his voice going thick with a kind of excitement that made my stomach turn into a knot of cold iron. He remembered her face, but he couldn't quite place mine. I decided it was time to end the lesson. I pretended to fiddle with one of the wall outlets, letting out a frustrated sigh. I told him the camera wasn't lighting up, that every single one I'd installed was dead. It was the perfect bait for a guy who thought he was the smartest person in the room. He marched over, cursing my incompetence, and shoved me aside to inspect the wires. He didn't even see the storm coming. One snap, that was the sound of his wrist giving up on life. I caught his arm and twisted, feeling the bone grind under my grip as he let out a strangled yelp. Before he could even process the pain, I had him on the floor. I grabbed a roll of electrical wire and started wrapping it around his fingers, pulling it tight enough to cut off the circulation. I leaned in close, my shadow swallowing him whole. I told him it was a lucky day for him, since he was a piece of trash. I didn't have to feel a single spark of remorse for what I was about to do. He started screaming, calling me a bastard, demanding to know why I was doing this. I didn't answer with a punch. I answered with a name, Lee Nian. I whispered it into his ear, like a death sentence. I told him exactly who she was, the sister of the nerd he found so hilarious. I felt his body go limp for a second, the sheer terror of the revelation hitting him harder than my fist ever could. I tightened the wire around his fingers and told him to laugh now. I wanted to see that same disgusting smirk he had when he was talking about her. My mind drifted back to the years I spent in Neun's shadow. She was always the strong one. I was the small, sickly kid who used her as a human shield against the world. Even after the fire, when our house was nothing but a pile of charcoal and our grandmother was rotting in a state-run facility, she was the one who kept us afloat. I remember my mother's voice, trembling as she asked if I'd really been the one to start the fire. She wanted to believe her son wasn't a monster, but the evidence Yoonbyum had planted was a mountain she couldn't climb. She asked if I was being bullied, if I was being forced to do things I didn't understand. I just sat there in silence, the shame of my own weakness choking the truth right out of my throat. Then Neun would walk in, slamming the door and demanding to know why our lives had turned into a dumpster fire. She was a physical education major, a powerhouse of optimism and muscle, and she looked at our misery like it was a challenge she could overcome with enough grit. She didn't know that the people who had done this to us weren't just bullies. They were architects of destruction. I looked down at Kyungmin's pathetic face and remembered how it felt to be the group chat slave. Back in high school, I wasn't just a punching bag. I was a digital toy. Yoonbyum and his crew had a group chat where every single one of my movements had to be approved by a guy with a profile picture of a cartoon dog. I couldn't eat, I couldn't move, I couldn't even breathe without a notification on my phone telling me it was okay. I remember the day I sat in class, a stack of photocopied documents in front of me, asking the chat if I could finally go to the bathroom. The response was a simple, clinical, no. I spent the next hour in an agony that had nothing to do with textbooks. The laughter of the guys in the back of the room was a physical weight, a reminder that I was less than human in their eyes. I remember the smell of the hallway, the sound of their sneakers on the linoleum as they kicked my legs out from under me. I was a walking pile of luggage, buried under a mountain of their backpacks and expensive iPads. I hit the dirt, the sound of their electronics clattering on the ground, echoing like a death knell. For a second, there was silence, and then the vultures descended. They didn't care if I was hurt. They only cared about the potential scratches on their tablets. One of them kicked me in the ribs, a hard, dull thud that knocked the remaining air out of my lungs, shouting about how I'd better not have broken anything expensive. It was a penalty, they said, a lesson in being a better servant. I laid there in the dust, staring at the blurred shapes of their sneakers, wondering how much more of this my soul could take before it just dissolved. That's when she appeared, Neon. I saw her through a gap in their legs, a silhouette of pure, unadulterated fury. She didn't hesitate. She didn't try to reason with them. She wove through those vultures like a storm front, her hand connecting with the first kid's face with a sound like a gunshot. The snickering stopped instantly, replaced by the panicked scrambling of cowards who had finally met someone who could actually fight back. She was a PE major, a force of nature compared to these pampered Gangnam brats. She slapped the teeth out of their mouths, her voice a cold, hard blade, asking them what kind of thugs they thought they were. In that moment, she was my hero. But as I watched her dismantle them, I made the mistake of looking at Yeonbeom. He wasn't running. He wasn't even scared. He was staring at my sister with a look that made my blood turn to ice. It wasn't hatred. It was fascination. He watched her move, watched the way she stood her ground, and I saw a sick, predatory light flicker in his eyes. He muttered something about how cool she was, and in that instant, the game changed. He didn't want to break me anymore. He switched his permissions from mocking me to prohibiting me from even existing, all while his twisted mind began to weave a web around Neon. The scene shifted to our house later that night. The lights were on, casting long, wavering shadows across the cramped apartment. My phone was a buzzing hive of threats and demands, vibrating against my palm like a heartbeat. I tried to hide it, but Neon was too sharp. She snatched it away, her eyes scanning the group chat where I was being treated like a digital pet. She looked at me, and I saw the heartbreak behind her anger. I tried to lie, tried to say it was just a joke, but she knew. She didn't yell. She just pulled me into a hug, her voice going soft as she told me how tired I must be. She whispered that I didn't have to be alone anymore, that she was there now. I felt the hot sting of tears, the first time I'd let myself feel the weight of it all. She promised to handle it. She promised to protect me. I wanted to believe her, but looking back, that promise was the first nail in her coffin. She went to confront them, thinking she was dealing with schoolyard bullies. She didn't realize she was walking into a trap set by a professional psychopath. Kyung-min, that hollowed-out shell of a man, led her straight to Yeonbeom. He was waiting in his father's luxury car, smelling of expensive cologne and overconfidence. He tried to play the suave, misunderstood friend, acting as if his nickname, the guy who ran my life through a screen, was just some big misunderstanding. He talked about how close we were, how he was just looking out for me. Neon saw through it instantly. She didn't even let him finish his pathetic monologue. She grabbed him by the collar and dragged him out of that car, throwing him onto the pavement like a piece of trash. She stood over him, her voice cutting through his ego, asking if his parents knew he spent his time as a digital parasite. She saw the car, the wealth, and the arrogance, and she saw exactly what he was, a coward hiding behind a bank account. She slapped him again, a hard, stinging reminder that his juvenile law protection didn't mean anything in the real world. She told him she'd be watching him, that the game was over, but she didn't know how deep the rot went. Being beaten by a woman was the ultimate humiliation for a narcissist like Yeonbeom. As he crawled back into that car, his face bruised and his pride in tatters, I saw the exact moment his sanity snapped. He didn't want a pretty older sister. anymore. He wanted a trophy he could destroy. He looked at her standing there, so strong and so sure of herself, and he decided to take the one thing that made her feel powerful. I remember the headlights. That blinding, synthetic white light that turned the night into a hospital ward. And I remember his words, etched into my skull like a curse. "You're an athlete, right? I'll take those legs so you can crawl for the rest of your life." Yeon Beam didn't just want to win. He wanted to edit my sister's existence until she was nothing but a broken prop in his twisted movie. He aimed that luxury sedan like a hitman's bullet, turning her sprinting dreams into a pile of shattered bone and ruined tendons. She tried, you know? She didn't give up. She traded the track for the pool, learning to pull her weight through the water when her legs refused to carry her on land. But the golden boy wasn't satisfied with a handicap. He wanted a funeral. And eventually, he got it. Fast forward to the present, and I'm standing in a damp basement, leaning over the pathetic heap of meat known as Kyung-min. I ask him if the light finally turned on in that tiny, dark room he calls a brain. Does he remember the horrors they inflicted on my sister? The look in his eyes is priceless. Pure, jagged terror. He tries to bark at me, his voice cracking like a dry twig, telling me I can't possibly win with cheap tricks. I didn't answer with words. I answered with the electrical wire I'd been wrapping around his fingers. One sharp tug, and he let out a desperate, high-pitched squeal that sounded like pure, unadulterated panic. Cheap tricks? No, Kyung-min. This is a systematic deconstruction. I told him his limit had been reached. I told him I was here to vaporize everything he and Yeonbeom owned, one brick and one bank account at a time. And while he was busy, trying not to faint from the pain, my digital fuse was already burning. Across town, the golden boy was having a minor heart attack in his bedroom. I could practically feel his panic through the network. He was staring at his phone, watching his digital empire crumble in real time. Internet fraud? He must have been thinking. Every single account he owned, every stash of stolen money, every laundered one, frozen, suspended, locked away in a digital vault that I held the only key to. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. His face, a pale, sickly mask of confusion. All those accounts, connected to the safe bank book he'd so arrogantly handed me, were now nothing but useless strings of code. Back in the basement, I leaned in and whispered the next part of the script. I told Kyung-min that the golden boy was going to kill him. Not out of malice, but out of pure, frantic desperation. I showed him the bank book he'd given me, the one belonging to some anonymous homeless person. I told him I'd restored all the deleted transaction histories. Every one he'd skimmed off the top, every bit of private commission he'd been hiding from Yeonbeom. It was all there, glowing on the screen like a neon sign for betrayal. I played him like a cheap violin. I told him I'd reported all the accounts using his name. To the law, Kyung-min was the mastermind. To Yeonbeom, Kyung-min was the thief who triggered the freeze by being greedy. I gave him a choice. Stay silent and become the fall guy for a psychopath, or realize that I'm the only reason he's still breathing. I let the silence stretch out, heavy and suffocating, until the door finally burst open. Enter the Sword, Jang Soo. He's the 4th generation enforcer, a human tank with a temper that would make a volcano look chill. He stomped into the room, his eyes locked on Kyung-min, barking about the frozen accounts. He's been waiting for an excuse to dismantle Kyung-min, and I just handed him the blueprint. He called him a traitorous idiot, his voice dripping with the kind of bloodlust you can only get from someone who's been itching to pull the trigger. Then Yeonbeom arrived. He didn't scream, he didn't shout. He just walked in with that cold, clinical detachment that made him so dangerous. He looked at the data, looked at the frozen accounts, and looked at the mountain of evidence I'd carefully curated. He told Kyung-min that it wasn't his first time doubting him, but that this time, all the data points lined up perfectly. It was a beautiful moment of psychological warfare. Yeonbeom's own paranoia was doing more damage than my fists ever could. He told Kyung-min to confess, his voice a low, lethal whisper. That was my cue. I didn't wait for Kyung-min to open his mouth. I entered the room like a frantic, loyal dog whose master had just been insulted. I didn't say a word. I just launched a kick into Kyung-min's face that probably sent a few teeth on a permanent vacation. I went into a frenzy, hitting him until my knuckles were bruised, playing the part of the outraged new recruit who just lost his investment because of a traitorous junkie. I pulled a small packet out of Kyung-min's pocket, a little gift I'd planted earlier. He's a drug addict, I shouted, my voice a perfect mix of anger and disgust. You trusted your money to a junkie who's going to bring the whole organization down? Yeonbeom's eyes went wide. The drug angle was the final nail. It explained the erratic behavior, the missing money, the mistake that led to the freeze. He stood there, watching me beat the man he used to call his right hand, and I could see the wheels turning. He didn't want a loyal idiot anymore. He wanted a competent monster. Yeonbyum eventually had enough of the theater. He told me to stop, his voice sounding more curious than concerned. He wanted to know why I was so worked up over a junkie like Keeman. I didn't drop the act. I played the part of the pissed-off mercenary whose only god was the Almighty One. I looked Yeonbyum dead in the eye, breathing hard, and told him straight up, I didn't give a damn about his organization, but he promised me my money was safe. Now, thanks to this addict, my accounts were frozen, and my investment was gone. I asked him how he planned to pay me back for his subordinates' incompetence. I made sure my voice sounded like it was vibrating with pure, unadulterated greed. The sociopath actually sighed in relief. To him, money hungry was predictable. Money hungry was safe. He looked at me with that clinical, superior smirk and told me not to worry. He'd compensate me. But then, he leaned in, his tone dropping into that lethal, predatory hum he uses when he's about to buy someone's soul. He offered me Keeman's job. He figured I was smart. I understood how money moved, and I had the stomach to break people. It was a classic corporate promotion, just with more blood on the floor tiles and no HR department to complain to. Keeman was staring at me from the ground, his face a swollen map of betrayal. He'd finally put the pieces together. He realized I'd used him as bait, exploited the digital holes in their system, and manipulated Yeonbyum's own paranoia to erase him from the equation. He was looking at me like I was some kind of genius demon. He wasn't entirely wrong. He just didn't realize that everything he was feeling now, the loss, the terror, the helplessness, was just a tiny fraction of what my sister felt. But then, the atmosphere in the room changed. Jang-soo, the 2-meter-tall human tank, stepped in. He's the only one in this circus who actually has instincts. He leaned down, his massive frame blotting out the light, and told me my eyes were lying. He said he saw too much anger in them. Not the greedy anger of a thug, but something cold and permanent. He threatened to pluck my eyes out, just to see what was hiding behind them. I didn't back down. I let out a dry, jagged laugh, and asked him if he thought his height gave him a free pass to talk garbage to me. I was tempting fate, and I knew it. Jang-soo isn't a guy you talk back to. He's a guy you run away from. But I remembered the lessons I'd mastered. If you're fighting a giant, you don't fight fair. You fight smart. I was wearing a hoodie for a reason. Not for the aesthetic, but because of a specific trick I'd been taught. When a monster like Jang-soo tries to grab you, he expects resistance. He expects you to be a solid object. Instead, I gave him smoke. I taped my wig on tight, but I'd left the hoodie loose. When he lunged at me, roaring about how he was going to snap me like a twig, I didn't pull away. I charged him. He was confused for a split second. Most people don't run at the guy who can crush their skull with one hand. He grabbed my hoodie, thinking he had me dead to rights, and started to pull me in for the kill. That's when I slipped out of the hoodie like a snake shedding its skin. He was left holding a handful of cheap polyester while I was already low, moving like a shadow. The trick to beating a guy that big is to never let him settle his weight. I slammed my knee into his joint, feeling the shudder go through his massive frame, and then followed up with a strike that was designed to shatter his focus. It wasn't about winning a fight. It was about showing him that I was a nightmare he wasn't equipped to handle. Yeonbyum stepped in before we could truly tear each other apart. He told us to stop, his voice sharp with that golden boy authority. He seemed more entertained than anything, telling Jang-soo to back off. He officially handed me the keys to Keeman's kingdom, telling me that from now on, I was in charge of the digital sweatshop. Jang-soo was vibrating with rage, calling me a scheming rat, but he's a soldier. He follows the leader. He looked at me with pure hatred, promising that he'd be waiting for the moment I slipped up. Good. I wanted him watching. I wanted all of them watching while I systematically poisoned their well. I stood in front of that group of digital lowlifes, the ones who spent their days forging lives and ruining strangers, and gave them the shortest job description in history. I didn't care about their hierarchies or their technical jargon. I just told them that in this building, I was the law. If they wanted to breathe, they'd do it on my count. It was a beautiful moment of pure, unadulterated power, seeing the fear in their eyes as they realized the new guy was actually the guy who could make them disappear into their own databases. The contrast back at school was enough to make me want to vomit. I watched Yeonbyum standing at the front of the classroom, basking in the glow of Miss O's praise. He just placed in the top 10 of the entire school in the mock exams, and she was looking at him like he was the second coming of the Messiah. He did that fake little head scratch, the shucks, it was nothing routine, while practically vibrating with smugness. He even had the audacity to credit her dedicated teaching for his success. The class was eating it up, whispering about how they looked like a movie couple. It was a masterpiece of theater, and I was the only one who knew the lead actor was a serial killer in training. Our little history lesson on the Bronze Age was cut short by a very 21st century scandal. Mr. Kim, another respected educator, burst into the room looking like he'd just seen a ghost that was threatening his retirement fund. He didn't care about the lesson or the students. He only had eyes for his star pupil, Yeonbeom. Miss Oh looked concerned, but I just leaned back and watched the fireworks. Mr. Kim wasn't there for a friendly chat. He shoved a phone into Yeonbeom's face, his voice cracking with a desperation that only comes from a man who realizes his bribe money is about to be public knowledge. It turns out someone, meaning me and Anna, had leaked the truth on the school's anonymous forum. The ideal student hadn't actually studied for those mock exams. He just bought the answers from Mr. Kim. It was a classic pay-to-play scheme, and the bill had finally come due. Mr. Kim was panicking, babbling about how he'd told Yeonbeom to keep it quiet, while Yeonbeom just stared at the screen with a look that would have turned a weaker man into a puddle of ice. The golden boy didn't even try to play the victim. The second he realized Mr. Kim was compromised, he turned into a cold-blooded predator. He looked at the man he'd been paying for months and basically told him to watch his tone. He reminded Mr. Kim exactly who was holding the leash, asking him how much money had changed hands, and if he really wanted to see who would go down harder in a scandal. It was a beautiful display of mutual destruction. Two rats fighting over a sinking ship while the rest of the class sat in stunned silence. What they didn't know was that Miss O was standing right there, hidden in the shadows, listening to her favorite student and her colleague negotiate the price of their souls. I watched the realization hit her, the way her shoulders slumped as the illusion of her perfect classroom shattered, but the real punchline was still coming. I leaned in and whispered the final act of her nightmare, that thoughtful humidifier Yeonbeom had given her. The one she thanked him for so graciously was actually a 24/7 surveillance camera. Every word she'd spoken, every private moment she'd had at her desk, he'd been watching. He'd gifted her a front row seat to her own life, just so he could keep tabs on her. Miss O looked at that machine puffing out steam and looked like she was going to be physically ill. I told her not to run to the police just yet. The law in this country is a slow, blunt instrument, and Yeonbeom was a surgeon when it came to legal loopholes. I told her to let me handle it, that I was already dismantling his empire brick by brick, starting with the digital leeches he called friends. Later, in the gang's headquarters, the atmosphere was a lot less academic. Yeonbeom was pacing like a caged animal, furious that someone had dared to post his business on the school forum. Young-soo, our resident human tank, was doing what he does best, suggesting we punch every student in the school until someone confessed. I just rolled my eyes at his muscle-only logic, calling him a brainless idiot who couldn't find his own feet in the dark. I told him that instead of bruising knuckles, we should be tracking IPs. I produced a stack of papers, like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat, claiming I'd already done the legwork. I showed Yeonbeom a specific address, claiming the ghost who leaked the info was hiding there. I watched Yeonbeom's eyes light up with a sick kind of gratitude, praising me for actually being useful, while Jang-soo stood there looking like a confused boulder. I told them catching the student would be easy, and I made sure Jang-soo was the one I sent out to do the heavy lifting. I wanted him out of the way, chasing a phantom while I tightened the noose around Yeonbeom's neck. Yeonbeom actually thanked me, offering me more money as if that could ever pay for what he'd taken. I just smirked, reminding him that my services were never free, and that he should keep his wallet open for the next mess I'd have to clean up. He laughed, thinking he'd found the perfect, greedy ally. The next morning, I watched him walk into the classroom, his mask back in place, ready to play the victim of a hateful rumor. But I saw Miss O's face when she looked at him. She didn't see the star student anymore. She saw the voyeur, the briber, the monster. And as she called him to her desk, asking for help with the school cleaning, I knew the trap was set. I watched him walk up to her desk, his eyes darting toward that empty space where his digital eye used to sit. The golden boy was actually sweating, his voice vibrating with a desperate, pathetic tremor as he asked Miss O where the humidifier had gone. She played her part perfectly, stuttering, acting embarrassed, telling him the principal had moved it to improve the environment somewhere else. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head as he realized his private surveillance feed was now floating around the school, completely outside of his control. Yeonbeom is a predator who lives and breathes optics. He knows that in this country, a gender-based crime isn't just a scandal, it's a social execution. He stood outside the girls' restroom, clutching his palms until they bled, his perfect student mask cracking under the weight of pure, jagged panic. He thought he was being clever, tracking the device, assuming some idiot principal had moved it into the girls' stalls. He figured if he could just get it back, he could erase the trail before the law came knocking. Little did he know, I was the one who'd rewritten the script. Anna called me, her voice curious, asking if we were finally going to drop the hammer and expose him for spying on the girls. I just leaned back and let out a cold, sharp laugh. Spying on the girls is a rookie move. It's too predictable. I told her to hold off. I didn't put that camera in the girls' room. I put it in the boys' restroom. I didn't just want him to be a creep. I wanted him to be the ultimate pariah. I wanted the headline to be, Model Student Records Classmates in the Stalls. I watched the chaos unfold from the shadows. Mr. Dongguk, our resident gym teacher, who takes school spirit way too seriously, was the one who found it. He was fiddling with the device, wondering why the school was suddenly shelling out for new equipment. When he saw the lens, he saw that tiny, blinking red light staring back at him like a digital snitch. The roar of fury that came out of him probably shook the foundation of the building. He was already barking about serial numbers, tracking the purchase, and calling in the cavalry. And there was Yunbium, standing right in the middle of it all, frozen like a deer in the headlights of a freight train. He realized his brilliant plan had just turned into a digital guillotine. He tried to tell himself there was no proof, that he could talk his way out of it, but you could see the terror eating him from the inside out. Meanwhile, I'd sent Jiangsu, our human wrecking ball, on a wild goose chase. He thought he was being a loyal soldier, hunting down the ghost who revealed the truth about the leaked exam answers. I gave him an IP address and a location, and he walked straight into a nest of other delinquents. When they laughed at his muscle brain questions, he did what he does best. He became a one-man wrecking crew and dismantled the entire room. He walked out with blood on his knuckles and a smug look on his face, never realizing he was just a distraction I'd tossed into the gears to keep the noise level high. Later that night, the golden boy was back in his ivory tower, biting his nails until the skin was raw and bleeding. He was spiraling. The bribery, the voyeurism, the crumbling reputation, it was all converging on him at once. I decided to give him a call, just to see how the air tasted down in the abyss. I played the part of the dedicated subordinate, reporting on our business and the forged IDs we were pumping out, while he struggled to even breathe into the receiver. I told him I'd noticed he looked tired at school. He tried to blow me off, claiming he was just exhausted, that we'd talk tomorrow. But the jagged edges of his voice told a different story. He wasn't tired, he was drowning. I played the part of the loyal, concerned subordinate to a T, whispering into the receiver with just the right amount of artificial worry. I told him not to overthink it, that I was there to help just like last time. I reminded him that he was the leader, and serving him was my only purpose in life. It's amazing what people will believe when they're desperate. He finally cracked and asked me to meet him at the school gates. I showed up and saw a version of Yeonbiom that wouldn't have made it into any school brochures. He looked like a cornered rat, his perfect student mask replaced by a twitchy, sweat-slicked mess of a face. He tried to act like it was just a minor hiccup, but his eyes were darting around as if he expected the pavement to open up and swallow him. He told me he needed me to go back inside and retrieve that humidifier from the gym teacher's desk. A humidifier? I almost laughed. He was still trying to keep up the lie, even with me. I played along, acting confused, letting him explain that it was just a misunderstanding, and that I just needed to grab the blue and white machine and bring it back. He was frantic, practically vibrating with urgency, telling me it would solve everything. I walked into that school like a ghost. I reached into the gym teacher's drawer, my hand closing around the device, and I felt a surge of pure electric spite. In my head, I was already writing his obituary. Here lies Yeonbium, the boy who thought he was a king, undone by a piece of plastic. I handed it to him at the gates. Then I turned my back on him, walking away with a casual wave, while he stood there clutching that plastic bomb like it was a holy relic. I could feel him relaxing, probably thinking I was a solid worker, unlike that meathead Jiangsu. He started fumbling with the bottom of the device, desperate to find the SD card and erase the evidence. But then he saw it, a tiny, blinking light that hadn't been there before. The realization hit him like a freight car. While he was spiraling, I was remembering the conversation I had with Miss O a few days prior. I'd handed her a tiny, circular tracker, a sleek little piece of tech. I told her to hide it inside the humidifier. I knew her trust in me was thin, but her hatred for the creep recording her was thicker. I told her to wait, to watch, and to let the predator walk right into the snare. Back in the present, I adjusted my mask and watched the chaos from the shadows. A car roared past, tires screeching as it tore through the rain-slicked streets. Inside was Dongguk, the gym teacher, and he looked like a man possessed. He was staring at his phone, watching a little blue dot move across the digital map of the city. He wasn't just a teacher anymore, He was a bloodhound with a badge. He screamed into the cabin of his car that he was going to catch this pervert if it was the last thing he did. Yeonbyum was in full-blown flight mode now. He was sprinting through the alleys, smashing the humidifier against the concrete in a fit of manic rage. He fumbled through the plastic shards until he found the SD card, snapping the tiny piece of silicon in half and tossing it into a storm drain. He let out a ragged breath, thinking he'd won. He thought if there was no footage, there was no crime. He didn't realize that the evidence wasn't the goal. The signal was the goal. He collapsed against the side of a parked car, gasping for air and wiping the rain from his eyes. He thought he'd vanished into the night, but then a voice boomed out of the darkness, sounding like a clap of thunder. "Hey, Siri." The phone in Yeonbyum's pocket chirped in response. "I'm listening," the digital assistant whispered, her voice bright and cheery in the middle of his nightmare. Dong-guk stepped out of the shadows, looking down at the golden boy with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. He'd spent 10 years at that school, and he'd never seen a piece of work as rotten as this. He didn't see the top student, he saw the predator. Yeonbyum didn't even try to fight. He just turned and ran, his legs pumping with the kind of terror you only feel when the world finally sees you for what you are. While Yeonbyum was being hunted by a gym teacher with a vendetta, I had my own visitor. I was standing in the rain, feeling the water soak through my clothes, when a mountain of a man blocked my path. Jang-soo. He looked like he'd crawled out of a battlefield, his clothes stained with blood that wasn't his. He looked at me with eyes that were red, with a mix of rage and exhaustion. He told me he'd found me, and that today was the day I stopped breathing. I didn't even give him the chance to finish his last stand speech. I lunged forward, my boot meeting his jaw with a satisfying crack that echoed through the rain. I looked down at Jang-soo, his face contorted in a mix of shock and agony, and I couldn't help but smile. He thought he was the hero of some underdog story, but in my world, he was just an obstacle that needed to be paved over. And before he could find his feet, I was on him again. He was leaning on his back leg, trying to find his balance. The same mistake he'd made 5 minutes ago. I pointed it out with a dry laugh, reminding him that in a street fight, especially under a downpour, your stance is the only thing between you and a body bag. He looked panicked now, his pupils blown wide, as I grabbed his sleeve. It was time for the Houdini choke. It's a beautiful bit of violence. It looks like a standard grapple, but with a few technical adjustments, my own hoodie becomes a lethal weapon. I tightened the fabric across his throat, watching the realization dawn on him. He clawed at the air, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps, and I just watched with a cold, clinical curiosity. I felt his strength leave him, his arms dropping like lead weights as the darkness finally claimed him. But the giant had one last spark in him. He surged back to life for a split second, his massive hands gripping my sleeve with a strength that suggested he was ready to take me to hell with him. I didn't let that hope flicker for even a second. I twisted the fabric, locking his neck into a position that guaranteed a trip to the void. I whispered into his ear that it was over, that he'd be unconscious before he could even pray. As he drifted off, I wondered if he was dreaming about those nature documentaries he used to love. He probably saw himself as a crocodile, the apex predator of the Amazon, the king of the river who never lets go once his jaws are locked. Too bad for him. He's not the crocodile in this story. I am, and my bite is a lot more permanent. I looked at his limp body and pulled out my phone. I told Anna I was okay, that I needed her to come clean up the mess. Meanwhile, across town, Yeonbyum was having the worst night of his life. He thought he'd escaped the gym teacher, Dong-guk, but the old man was like a bloodhound. He'd caught Yeonbyum by the leg, his voice a roar of righteous fury. Yeonbyum didn't have a noble bone in his body though. He turned into a cornered rat, raining down kicks on the old man's face, screaming about how teachers should just mind their own business. It was pathetic, even for him. He left the teacher bleeding in the rain, thinking he'd won. But when he heard the sirens, his sanity finally started to unravel. He leaned against a wall, gasping for air, clutching his phone like it was a life preserver. He tried to call Jang-soo, but the sword wasn't answering. He was all alone in the dark, and that's when I stepped out of the shadows. I played the part of the concerned ally one last time. I asked him what happened, my voice thick with artificial worry. He looked at me like I was his savior, begging me to take him somewhere safe. I felt a jolt of pure, electric joy, exactly according to plan. I told him I'd take him where he needed to go. I didn't mention that the destination was the 9th circle of hell. Before he could process where I was taking him, I had my arm around his neck. I watched the world go dark for him, whispering that we had a lot to talk about. When he woke up, he was shivering in the middle of a swimming pool. He scrambled to his feet, coughing out water, his eyes darting around the empty, cavernous room. He shrieked my name, demanding to know why I was doing this. I just stood on the edge, looking down at him with a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. I asked him if he remembered the story of the Little Mermaid. He looked at me like I was insane, babbling about fairy tales while his life was falling apart. I told him it was a story about a princess who wanted legs and the price she had to pay for them. I let the silence hang there, heavy and suffocating. I pulled a chain and the water started to drain. I told him not to worry about the fairy tale because I was about to give him a hands-on history lesson. I looked at the tattoo on my chest and whispered that I was going to make him remember everything. I remember Niun in the water. She was a goddess in the pool, a force of nature that broke records and won races without even breaking a sweat. She was invincible. I remember the way the crowd roared for her and the way I cheered from the stands, so proud of the sister who had rebuilt her life from the ashes of our house. But Yeonbyum didn't care about her talent or her resilience. To him, she was just a prop in his movie. I watched him scramble toward the edge of the pool, desperate to escape the draining water, only to find that the entire floor was covered in rows of sharp, industrial nails. Every step he took was a gamble with his own skin. He shrieked in agony as the metal bit into his feet, realizing that the land he was so desperate for was just another cage. I stood above him, watching him bleed into the blue water, and felt a cold, jagged sense of peace. I remember sitting in the courtroom, watching the gears of justice grind my soul into the floor tiles. Case number 22,000. Just a digit to them, but the end of the world for me. The judge looked at the file with the kind of bored indifference you'd expect from a guy reading a grocery list. On one side, you had the victim, shattered, broken, a life derailed. On the other, the ideal son. Yeonbyum sat there looking like a saint in a school blazer, spinning some fairy tale about how he accidentally slammed the gas instead of the brake. Pedals are so confusing when you're a sociopath, right? The judge didn't even flinch. He just declared that since the kid was a minor and lacked formal driver training, compensation was basically off the table. He treated my sister's ruined future like a fender bender. 180 hours. That was the price of a human soul in the eyes of the law. 180 hours of community service. A few weeks of picking up trash in a park, and he was back to being the golden boy. But the real rot started after the verdict. Niun, she was a shadow of herself. She'd spent hours staring at screens where the digital vultures were already picking at her carcass. Yeonbyum was smart. He didn't just break her body. He poisoned the well. He manipulated the narrative until the victim became the villain in the eyes of the internet. People didn't see a champion athlete whose legs were stolen. They saw a headline they could use for a quick hit of moral superiority. I remember the night she stopped fighting. I stood outside her door, begging her to let me in, telling her that mom was worried that I was there. Silence. It's a heavy thing, the silence of someone who's already decided they aren't coming back. While I was calling her, she was on the rooftop. She looked so small against the skyline, a broken doll looking for an exit. By the time I reached her, she was gone. The phone she dropped was still ringing, my call, a second too late. She'd lost her voice because a sea witch in a designer blazer decided her pain was content. Fast forward to the present, and I'm looking down at the same sea witch, currently bleeding into the blue water of a pool. I asked him if he remembered me, not the hot boy transfer student, but the nerd from class 2, the one whose sister he erased. He looked at me with those wide, pathetic eyes, finally realizing that the person he'd tried to delete was the one holding the leash. The pool floor was a forest of industrial nails, and every time he moved, he was paying the mermaid's price. I watched him scramble, his arrogance dissolving into a pool of frantic, jagged terror. He shrieked about how I was insane, how he didn't even know who I was. It's funny how they always forget. To him, we were just insects under his boot. To me, he was my only reason for living. I jumped down into the pool, my boots crushing the water as I approached him. I didn't use a knife. I didn't need one. I had his own car keys, the same ones from the night he aimed that sedan at Niun. I looked at the metal in my hand and felt a cold, sharp sense of irony. I asked him why he was still driving that car. Was it a trophy? A reminder of his perfect crime? I didn't wait for an answer. I just started swinging. Every strike was a payment for a memory. For the track meets she'd never run. For the night she spent crying in a dark room. For the sound of the wind on that rooftop. I beat him until his golden boy face was a map of purple bruises and regret. Apologize, I whispered. It was a simple request, one word. But even now, his narcissism wouldn't let him. He actually laughed. A wet, disgusting sound. He told me he'd never apologize to a loser like my sister, that she was probably burning in hell anyway. I felt the last thread of my restraint snap. Then a shadow fell over the pool. Jiangsu. Yeonbyum's eyes lit up with a sick kind of hope. He started shrieking for help, telling his sword to kill me, to finish the nerd who dared to touch him. He thought his muscle had arrived to bail him out. He thought his money still bought him protection. Jiangsu walked to the edge of the pool, his massive frame blotting out the rain. He looked down at the pathetic, bleeding heap that was his employer. He didn't look at me. He didn't have to. We'd already settled our business. Jiangsu remembered the hospital bills. He remembered the way Yanbeom had treated his mother like a pawn to keep him on a leash. Instead of jumping in to save the golden boy, Jiangsu just stood there for a second, then delivered a punch that probably rearranged Yanbeom's skull. The sound of it was a dull thud, followed by the sight of Yanbeom hitting the concrete like a sack of trash. The hope in his eyes didn't just fade, it shattered. I watched the realization hit Jiangsu like a freight train. It wasn't just anger, it was a total internal collapse. Anna stood there, looking as cold as the rain. I was holding the medical records that proved his saintly benefactor was actually his mother's slow-motion executioner. Yanbeom hadn't delayed that surgery for her safety. He'd done it to keep his pet pit bull on a leash. The records didn't lie. Her condition wasn't a tragedy. It was a manufactured crisis, designed to keep Jiangsu desperate and loyal. I watched him stare at the papers, his mind finally connecting the dots. His mother wasn't recovering. She was a permanent resident of room 801 because the golden boy wanted an enforcer who had nowhere else to turn. Jiangsu didn't need a lawyer. He knew he was too stupid to play the legal game, a game where Yanbeom's family owned the board, the pieces, and the judge. So, he chose the only language he'd ever been allowed to speak, blunt force trauma. Every punch he landed on Yanbeom's face was a down payment on years of manipulated servitude. Yanbeom's perfect features were quickly becoming a Jackson Pollock painting of regret and shattered teeth. Jiangsu wasn't just fighting, he was trying to punch the lies right out of the universe. I had to step in before the human tank turned the golden boy into a permanent stain on the pavement. Not because I felt pity. Mercy was a luxury I'd burned away years ago, but because dead men don't pay medical bills or suffer through a slow, humiliating downfall. I caught Jiangsu's arm, telling him that if he finished this now, he'd never be able to afford the care his mother actually needed. Jiangsu finally stopped, his knuckles a raw, bloody mess. He walked away, finally cutting the leash, but leaving Yanbeom with a parting gift. A promise that if the money for his mother's new hospital didn't arrive, the next meeting would be at a morgue. With Jiangsu gone, I was left alone with the wreckage. Yanbeom started the waterworks, crocodile tears that were honestly an insult to actual crocodiles. He babbled about self-reflection, about how he was sorry, and how he'd spend the rest of his life making it up to me. It was the most pathetic performance I'd seen yet, a desperate attempt to play the victim now that his muscle had abandoned him. He actually thought he could self-reflect his way out of a decade of sociopathic destruction. I didn't buy a second of it. I pulled out the drive Keeman had given me, the digital ledger of every dirty one he'd ever laundered, every bribe he'd paid, and every secret he thought was buried under his grandfather's influence. I told him the golden boy mask was officially shattered. I wasn't just some delinquent. I was the ghost who had systematically dismantled his entire life from the inside out. I watched his eyes shift from repentant victim to desperate predator in a heartbeat. He tried one last play. He snatched the car keys, the same ones from the night he aimed a sedan at my sister, and bolted for his car. He actually thought he could drive away from his own ghost. He threw me a middle finger, floored the engine, and laughed like he'd won the lottery. He was shouting insults about how stupid I was, how he'd just buried the scandal with his family's money, and how I'd never catch him. He was so busy being the hero of his own escape movie that he didn't notice the pedals felt a little light. He was floored, his thumb dancing over his phone to call his daddy's media contacts, thinking he'd left me in the dust. He didn't realize the dust was the only thing holding his world together. Then came the realization. I watched from the overlook as his headlights suddenly swerved. He wasn't following the curve of the road anymore. He was heading straight for the warning barrier. I could imagine his foot slamming into that brake pedal, only to feel it go soft and useless, like a sponge. In that split second, the golden boy finally understood that physics doesn't take bribes. He plowed through the guardrail, the car flipping through the air like a discarded toy, before it vanished into the black abyss of the cliffside. Anna appeared beside me, her red umbrella tilted against the rain. She asked if I was okay, but her voice was just a calm hum against the sound of the storm. She'd handled the logistics, cleared the perimeter, made sure no other cars were in the area. No witnesses, no collateral damage, just a sociopath and a very long drop. She mentioned that even at the very end, the bastard couldn't find the breath to apologize. I didn't need his apology. Apologies are for people who intend to change. Yanbeom was just a parasite who'd finally run out of hosts. I stood there, watching the smoke rise from the wreckage far below, and felt the weight of my sister's name on my chest. They say If you make someone cry, you should be prepared to bleed. Yeonbeom had turned my family's life into a lake of tears, so it was only fair I let him drown in his own